Chapter 33 August 1989, Beijing. John woke with a groan. When he moved to sit up, every bone and muscle in his body screamed in protest, and his limbs refused to move properly. He curled into a ball as a violent stab of pain cramped his belly. Clamping his arms against his stomach until the pain eased, he blinked, trying to focus on his surroundings, and forced himself to sit up. Instead of his comfortable hotel room, the dim moonlight showed a narrow room, bare except for a wooden table and a straight-backed chair in the corner by the door. The stained mattress he lay on was rock-hard and covered only by a thin blanket. With a grimace and another moan, he fell back on the bed as memory returned. He'd been arrested. He was in prison, specifically one of the highest security detention centers in Beijing. The officer had noted with a satisfied smirk. John pressed his hands against his burning eyeballs and fought despair. He had met David Yang in the bar. About 10 minutes after he sat down, 2 men walked in, conspicuous in the trendy westernized setting for their lack of flashy gold jewelry and expensive clothes. Both wore the cheap, wrinkled business suits typical of Chinese officials. One stood just inside the door, looking around as if he were searching for a friend. The older man was short, about 40, and sat at the bar next to a young woman with heavy makeup. He whispered to her as he watched John from behind his thick glasses. His presence gave John a chill. John already had David's passport in his hand. He made a show of saying goodbye and shaking David's hand, discreetly dropping the passport on David's lap under the table. Before they even had time to stand up, though, the young woman swaggered up with a leering smile and draped herself over John's shoulder. He tried to protest and step away from her, saying he had an appointment, but she hung on to him, snaking her arm around his waist and insisting, in broken English, that he buy her a drink. David, meanwhile, backed away from the table, trying to disappear into the crowd, until the woman suddenly flung herself at him, shouting in Chinese. Her voice rose to a screech as her fists beat at his face and chest. John tried to pull her away from David and caught an elbow to his jaw as she flailed, sending him staggering backward. Before he could recover his balance, the 2 Chinese men were in his face, shouting with guns pointed. "Nobody move. We're from the Criminal Investigation Squad. Both of you are under arrest." On cue, uniformed policemen swarmed into the bar, surrounding the table. John stood stunned, wondering whether David had betrayed him. "What? What's happening?" he stammered. The older detective shot a look at John and then turned to David and unleashed a flood of Chinese. When he stopped for breath, David tried to apologize to John for causing trouble. But before he could get the words out, the younger detective slapped David across the face, sending him crashing to the floor. He lay still, dazed, as blood spurted from his nose and spread down his chest. "You bastard!" John shouted, reaching down to help David. The detective's knee collided with his stomach, and John doubled over, unable to breathe. The room spun around him as his lungs strained for air. He heard the harsh voice from a distance through the haze of pain and darkness. "You are under arrest for prostituting a Chinese woman and interfering with social order." John pulled himself up, gasping. "That's ridiculous. This is some kind of misunderstanding. I've never met this woman before. She came up and accosted me, not the other way round." "We shall see," said the young detective with a sneer. John stared at him, angry but still calm. He knew there was no point in arguing. The Chinese government usually treated foreigners with more respect than its own citizens. "I am an American diplomatic officer. You can't do this to me," he protested. "Shut up! This is China, not America!" The older detective signaled to the policeman, who moved in to surround them. David lay on the ground, completely still, staring at John until a policeman yanked him to his feet and pushed him toward the door. In his eyes, John saw a mixture of fear, pride, and relief. At least he no longer had to bear the shame of running and hiding. Even knowing he would likely go to jail for years, he had stood up for his beliefs and made his voice heard. His conscience was clear. John sat in an interrogation room for a long hour after they arrived at the detention center. It was precious time, allowing him to think through the episode. Who had sold him out? How did it go so wrong? What would be the consequences of his arrest? What should he do next? By the time the two detectives and a young policewoman finally walked in, John had a strategy for the conversation. They sat down across the table from him, and the senior detective started the questioning. "Please state your name, nationality, and business in China." The woman translated his question, her face a blank. "John Thompson, cultural attaché with the Shanghai American Consulate. May I talk to the U.S. ambassador now?" The first step was to establish his diplomatic protection. "Perhaps later. That will depend on your attitude," said the detective in a superior manner. "Tell us about your friend." John remembered the golden rule of an intelligence officer. The less you talk, the less trouble you find. He shrugged. "We met at the bar. Although lots of Chinese speak some English, very few can speak it as fluently as David does. We were just chatting. That's all." "Nonsense! You think we believe you?" The detective raised his voice. "I'm a diplomatic officer. I'm telling the truth." The younger detective stood up and slammed his fist on the desk. "You Americans are all liars. You are helping David escape to your country. You know he is a criminal under government order of arrest." John stayed calm, his mind sorting through his options. He could say nothing, argue back, or pretend to cooperate. The senior detective eyed John, flipping through David's passport. "We have been investigating David for weeks. He is a traitor to our country. If you don't confess, we will charge you as a spy. You will go to jail and never see your country again." The interrogators were fishing for evidence, he knew, trying to frighten him with threats and hoping he would say something incriminating. The thick, stale air was oppressive, almost stifling in the tiny room. John said nothing, his face an indifferent mask. He was determined not to be the one to back down first. The detective walked around the table to stand over him. John could feel the man's eyes boring into the back of his head and hear the rasping breath in his ear. "Did he give you money to buy a visa for him?" "No," replied John firmly. "Did he tell you about his role in Tiananmen Square?" "Was he at Tiananmen Square? I didn't know that." "He stole thousands of dollars from other students there. Students believed his lies and donated their money to him, risking their lives. And all the time he was luxuriating at a fancy hotel with rich food and a comfortable bed. He is a thief, a criminal." John's mind raced. Maybe some of the students had betrayed David because they were bitter, jealous that he had money to escape overseas. That meant the security agency hadn't linked the money to either Ben or to him, so his arrest, along with David, could merely be a coincidence. Security had probably been watching David for a while, hoping to use him as bait to catch other, bigger fish. They likely thought John was the mastermind, one of the instigators behind the student movement, now trying to smuggle David out of China. He breathed the barest sigh of relief. certain that the authorities had no evidence to tie him to the protests. He looked at his interrogators, confident that he would be set free and could go back to Shanghai and Zoe soon. The detective put his hands on the table and leaned over, his face just a few inches from John's. "Did David tell you anything interesting?" "Oh, yes. We had a fascinating conversation. We exchanged ideas about practicing language. Since his English is quite good and I want to learn more Chinese, he offered to tutor me." "What else?" The detective thrust his nose forward even further in a menacing move. "That's all." "How did you meet him?" 2 weeks ago, I went to the English Corner at Jinshan Park. It's a beautiful spot, a place I can chat with people to improve my Chinese, and also learn about Chinese culture. That's where I met David, and his fluent English made a strong impression on me. The detective glared, but John saw a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. Even if the man half believed his story, he wasn't ready to give up yet. "Did you help him get a visa to go to America?" The detective repeated the question. "No. Any Chinese person can apply for a visa." He knew that the Chinese government couldn't make that accusation stick. David already had a passport, after all. With obvious frustration, the interrogator shoved a thick document toward John and screamed, "These are David's confessions. I advise you to confess too. That way you might avoid more severe punishment." John picked up the paper on top and scanned it, all written in Chinese. He pushed the papers back across the table with a laugh. "I can't read Chinese. This means nothing to me." With a scowl, the interrogator pulled another paper out of the folder and held it out to him. "If you sign this statement expressing regret for your illicit activities in China, we will consider pardoning you." This paper was written in English, but John refused to even touch it. "I won't read it, much less sign it. I haven't done anything wrong. Let me talk to the U.S. ambassador." "Typical American pig, thinking nobody can touch you," the man snarled. He stalked around the room and then swung back to face John. "This interrogation is over, for the moment. You will be held here for further questioning. However, you should know that our government's policy is to be lenient to those who confess their crimes. Those who refuse to confess face a far worse predicament." "You can't just lock me up here. I'm under the protection of international diplomatic law. You are required to let me speak to my ambassador." John's voice rose as the detectives headed out of the room without looking at him. Before he had finished speaking, the young detective had already slammed the door. As he heard the heavy lock click into place, John felt a tremor run through him. For the first time since his arrest, he suddenly feared that he might be shoved into a Chinese prison for the rest of his life. What assurance did he have that communist China would follow international law? His heart wrenched, and he buried his face in his hands to keep from screaming her name. Zoe. The interrogation sessions followed no logical pattern of time or method. Sometimes John was beaten, and sometimes the questions came so fast he didn't even have time to answer them. Once, the detective hadn't even bothered closing the door and simply roared, "Why are you here?" before turning and stalking back out. John lost track of time. His only reference point to the outside world was whether the patch of sky he saw out the tiny, barred window showed light or dark. The latest interrogation session lasted hours. When his interrogators finally left, a young policeman came in, set a box of noodles on the table, and left without a word. Unable to remember the last time he'd eaten, John wolfed it down, grateful for the simple meal. The noodles gave some relief to the constricting feeling in his empty belly, but the taste, mingled with the stench of his own stale sweat and blood, made him gag. He straightened his back against the hard wooden chair and pushed himself to his feet with difficulty, rubbing his gritty eyes against the harsh light of the bare bulbs overhead. As he had after every session, he forced himself to move around the cramped space, both to relieve the stiffness of his aching body and give himself hope by doing something. Each time he passed it, his hand trailed across the single door. He wondered yet again what was outside it. Was David next door, being interrogated as well, even tortured? Had anything happened to Ben? What was Zoe doing? He had only made 3 turns around the room when he heard the bolt sliding back. Bracing himself against the far wall, sure he couldn't handle another round of beatings, the thought flashed through his mind that maybe he should just confess. But the senior detective stepped aside to hold the door open for another man. John almost wept with relief. Hugh McKay was in his late 50s, a little on the pudgy side, and a perfect caricature with a sparse layer of white hair painstakingly combed across the bald spot on top of his head. Despite the jokes, the deputy chief of mission for the Beijing embassy commanded respect. As soon as the door closed behind him, Hugh leaned on the table in exasperation. "You must be insane. What in God's name were you doing with a prostitute and a drug dealer?" "That's total rubbish. You can explain everything on the way to the airport," Hugh interrupted angrily. "You've been ordered to leave China within 24 hours. I'm taking you to your apartment right now to pack." John stared at him, barely able to comprehend the words. Even in the darkest moments of his interrogation, he had never imagined he would be kicked out of China without even a chance to say goodbye to Zoe. If she were somehow linked to him, if the security agency started looking into his activities in China, her career would be over. She might be jailed, or worse. His heart shattered. Riveted to the chair, unable to move, his only thought was that she would never trust him again. He didn't dare try to get a message to her, or even speak her name. His fists tightened with rage. He wanted to punch the interrogators for their petty meddling in his life, to pummel Hugh just for doing his job. Only the knowledge that there was nothing he could do that would help Zoe kept his fury under control. Inhaling sharply, he straightened himself up and forced the words out through gritted teeth. "Thank you, Hugh. Let's go."